Construction and the climate, forever chemicals, PFAS and the construction industry.
Welcome to Construction and the Climate. This is a podcast series from 39 Essex Chambers with me, Camilla, Haar and Ruth Keating.
In this podcast series, we'll be discussing the big climate issues affecting the construction sector. Today we're joined by Michael Salau and Nathan Modell. Both Michael and Nathan are partners in Beale & Co., a firm which has over 180 years' experience providing specialist legal advice to the construction and insurance sectors. Michael practices in both the construction and environmental sectors. His environmental practice involves advising and defending clients on issues arising from pollution and contamination and any related enforcement actions. He also advises clients on insurance coverage issues relating to the clean-up of environmental damage, pollution and on environmental legislation, with a particular expertise in waste and waste management. He has been instructed and advised on a number of cases in the defence of large-scale environmental group claims. Michael also advises construction professional firms on construction law, practice and procedures encompassing arbitration, adjudication and mediation, as well as litigation, and defends a range of construction clients on construction disputes, regulatory and prosecution matters. We also have Nathan joining the podcast today. Nathan specialises in contentious construction matters. He advises a range of construction professionals, including architects, engineers, project managers, surveyors, and their insurers on both domestic and international projects. Since 2018, he has also overseen the firm's environmental, social and governance policies and activities. So two very busy people on the podcast today. But on top of that, they've also written two excellent articles recently on this topic. So the first is Managing the Risks of Forever Chemicals, PFAS in the Construction Industry, and Are Forever Chemicals akin to the new asbestos risk, which is what we'll be talking about today. The issue is clearly extremely important and topical. I don't think you could read the news without seeing something about PFAS and forever chemicals. And of course, recently on the 3rd of February, the government released the UK's first ever plan to tackle forever chemicals. And in that PFAS plan, the government has set a framework for that coordinated action that's expected to be undertaken by governments, businesses and regulators to understand where these chemicals are coming from, how they spread, and how to reduce that public and environmental exposure. So thanks to both Michael and Nathan for joining us on the podcast today as we talk about PFAS or forever chemicals. And to get us started, I'm conscious that this is a topic that some of our listeners will have heard about, or certainly they'll have heard the term before. But I think it would be helpful to explain what exactly are we talking about when we talk about PFAS or forever chemicals.
Good morning, everyone. To initially describe these, what are commonly known as forever chemicals, and also interchangeably being called PFAS. From a chemical perspective, PFAS or polyfluoroalkyl substances are a group of more than 14,000 to 15,000 synthetic man-made chemicals. Originally they were a almost magic formula because they're fantastically resistant to heat. They're also stain resistant and they're also water resistant. One of the difficulties though is that, and this is why we get the name forever chemicals, are that they stay in the environment for possibly hundreds of years. And so that possesses and causes the main problem we have with these chemicals. We see them in a range of things, particularly cleaning products, food packaging, also cosmetics, and also in firefighting foam. As we'll talk later, some of the issues with it being contained in industrial products like firefighting foam causes the problems that we are seeing now, and potentially we will see in the future.
It's really helpful to hear a few of the things that the PFAS are found in, but how are they used in the construction sector?
Well, as Michael said, PFAS have a wide range of positive properties, wide construction products and materials, including roofing, paints and other coatings, adhesives and sealants, timber-treated products, as well as insulation, for example. They're used in these products to enhance a product's material performance, be that water, stain or heat resistant, for example, as well as to improve longevity of the product itself. However, the useful properties of PFAS also make PFAS highly persistent in the environment, leading to growing concerns about the long-term impact on both ecosystems and human health.
So you've touched off that there, Nathan. Clearly, there's an issue around these forever chemicals being highly persistent in the environment and some of the points that you've touched off there. What kind of harms are presented by them generally?
So we've seen a number of scientific studies that have identified a number of health concerns resulting from the use of PFAS. As research is evolving, there's a growing, and I would say a robust evidence of exposure to PFAS can lead to a number of issues. Just by way of example, there are certain reproductive effects. So we're seeing decreased fertility or higher blood pressure in pregnant women. We're seeing developmental effects as well, so delays in children in relation to delays in relation to birth rate, but also accelerated puberty. Perhaps also particularly worrying a higher risk of certain cancers, certainly in prostate, breast, kidney, and testicular cancer. And also things like immune suppression. So we're seeing really real issues arising around health effects. And as a result of that, obviously, in terms of, from a legal perspective, we will see those rise in personal injury and bodily harm claims arising from these effects that people are suffering as a result of exposure to PFAS.
So the issues and concerns around those issues are pretty wide-read and alarming. Can you tell us and our listeners whether the PFAS can be removed from the environment?
So with regards to removal of PFAS from the environment, one of the issues I raised earlier on in relation to the definition in relation to PFAS are the fact that they are so durable and also widespread. And as a result of that, it does pose a significant challenge to remove PFAS from the environment. These chemicals, albeit man-made chemicals, are particularly difficult to remove or destroy because they're so persistent in nature. And so actually any exercise that seeks to remove them, and when we're talking about removals, we're talking about contamination or pollution. I think primarily we're talking about contamination or pollution of water supplies. That is particularly difficult. We've got, in truth, although, as I said, I think the growing bank of scientific evidence is growing, we've got limited knowledge about the toxicity of these thousands of PFAS compounds. As I said, at least 14, 15,000. So there are difficulties in removing because our knowledge is growing in relation to that. Having said that, perhaps an example of the difficulty shows the amount of money that is being spent, particularly in the US, not in the UK at the moment. So I'd say in relation to the US, I think reportedly in 2024, an American firm said that the estimated cost of remediating PFAS contamination in water systems would be between 120 and 175 billion dollars. So that gives you some idea of the money that's going to be spent in remediating. Of course, that's a separate thing from the fact that one of the issues we have is the incidence of PFAS within individuals and within society and humans. And there are issues as a result of how we're going to be able to lower the levels within individuals and within humans.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And as the sort of concerns and issues, that they're both financial and health related, quite considerable issues in those. So as awareness of PFAS related risks and scrutiny increases, we'll see the construction industry facing mounting pressure to reduce reliance on these chemicals and the products containing them. How do you see the construction industry responding to these known harms of PFAS?
There are several ways we see the construction industry responding. Firstly, how products containing PFAS will be dealt with. Secondly, what happens with PFAS contaminated sites? And thirdly, what happens with insurers and insurance? We'll take these three items in turn. I'll speak to the first two, and then Michael will cover the insurance and insurer issues separately. So in terms of products containing PFAS, for contractors, developers and engineers, managing contractual obligations related to PFAS is going to become essential for mitigating environmental, reputational and financial risk in the future. We might see an increase in contracts which seek to include specific clauses that explicitly or indirectly prohibit the use of PFAS materials in construction. For example, certain definitions of prohibited or deleterious materials can be drafted broadly and capture substances or products which are harmful to the human health or to the environment. And as Michael said, because we're talking about a range of 14 to 15,000 chemicals, that could be a very wide definition that could include any number of those chemicals or products containing them. And these clauses are often accompanied by strict compliance and reporting requirements. So as awareness of the environmental and health concerns surrounding PFAS continues to grow, we think that construction professionals should start to take a proactive approach by ensuring that they review their contracts now to ascertain whether they explicitly address the potential presence of PFAS in products or materials that they're going to specify in those projects, but also to have a look at their supply chain to see where they may be at risk of exposure to products that contain PFAS. To manage or reduce their liability and also to respond to wider ESG requirements, we can see that contracts from employer and developer clients will start to require full disclosure from contractors, consultants and suppliers regarding the presence of PFAS in their products, along with commitments to use safer alternatives where these become available and feasible. We can see that specifications may need to be updated in the future to exclude PFAS containing materials, again, where this is possible. And we can also see or foresee the use of independent third-party verification programs to provide assurance in respect of the products containing or not containing PFAS. In addition, liability clauses and indemnities should be carefully reviewed to ensure that any responsibility for PFAS-related risks is clearly allocated and managed according to provide appropriate protection from unexpected legal and remediation costs. This is all before regulations actually banning the use of PFAS come into force in several jurisdictions. And this includes the proposed ban in the EU, which after some watering down is due to come into force over the next few years. Now that's likely to have an impact on us here in the UK and other jurisdictions where it's very likely that we'll start to see PFAS bans coming into force. So in terms of PFAS contaminated sites, the widespread nature of contamination poses an obvious risk, not just to those sites directly affected by PFAS contamination, but also to the surrounding areas. And this is because the PFAS chemicals can transfer through soil, water and air, and therefore the contamination can be far wider than just the original site of the contamination. And just to put that into some context in the UK, the Environmental Agency has identified up to 10,000 high-risk sites in the UK. And as Michael touched on earlier, in terms of the cost of remediating the water system in the US, the estimates in the UK are for remediation of those 10,000 sites that are identified at the moment is expected to be about £428 million for the next 20 years, each year for the next 20 years. So it's a huge, huge number. And just one good example of the types of contamination we might see are the Buncefield oil depot fire in 2005, which hopefully some listeners will remember. And that was believed to be the largest peacetime fire in Europe. And there was wide-scale contamination of the site due to the PFAS-containing firefighting foam that was used to try and extinguish that fire. And as Michael touched on earlier, PFAS have many, many useful properties. And one of those useful properties is that they make excellent surfactants, which makes them highly effective in firefighting foams. It's been reported that approximately 250,000 litres of PFAS firefighting foam was used in the fire at Buncefield. So the immediate risk of the fuel-related pollution from the oil storage depot itself was compounded by the huge release of PFAS into the environment from the firefighting foam. So we've got a situation there where not only the firefighters that were deployed to fight the fire were exposed to huge doses of PFAS directly, but the PFAS chemicals also contaminated soil and groundwater as a result. Now, although initial testing that was done at the time indicated that PFAS levels in drinking water were within the regulatory limits at the time, subsequent reductions in the drinking water inspectorate's permissible levels have revealed that PFAS in the groundwater around Buncefield and the wider area are in fact extremely high as a result of the fire itself. So we think this highlights the long-term risks of PFAS contamination and the impacts that they might have on ecosystems and to public health and communities. These chemicals, as Michael has said, are very difficult and expensive to remove once they do enter the environment. And the Buncefield oil fire serves as an example of how regulations or how changes in regulations, the persistence of these substances in the environment and the ongoing environmental and health risks for those exposed make PFAS contamination a complex and involving issue to keep an eye on. The widespread presence of PFAS contamination on sites across the UK presents significant concerns for developers, consultants and contractors in the construction industry. For developers, purchasing land with historic PFAS contamination can lead to significant remediation costs, project delays and increased regulatory challenges. This underscores the importance of conducting thorough site investigations before acquiring land to assess potential liabilities, and keeping that testing and monitoring ongoing as well. Consultants, including geotechnical environmental specialists, might face increased liability in the future if PFAS contamination is overlooked, i.e. as part of surveys conducted or advice provided, or if these are not properly managed, especially as environmental and safety standards continue to tighten and acceptable levels of PFAS in soil and groundwater decrease over time in the regulations. We also think that contractors will potentially be affected as they are required to handle and dispose of any PFAS contaminated materials safely and appropriately. And this obviously adds complexity, costs and potentially extended programs to construction projects where we're dealing with contaminated land. As these challenges evolve, contractors, consultants and developers will need to adapt innovative solutions and proactive strategies to manage the growing risks associated with PFAS contamination. And that takes me on, I think, to handing over to Michael to discuss the insurance implications.
Thank you, Nathan. Just picking up particularly from the construction sector, we're now seeing, and certainly we've seen over the last few years, many essentially PFAS-specific exclusions, so limiting coverage for the liabilities that arise from contamination and pollution. So this obviously suggests a significant financial risk for contractors, consultants, developers, and other construction industry stakeholders as the cost of remediation and potential claims increase. Obviously, given this persistent nature of PFAS, and of course their widespread use in construction materials, insurers have been tightening their underwriting requirements, demanding quite extensive site assessments and risk mitigation strategies before providing or extending coverage. So these exclusions and limitations make it particularly critical for those within the construction industry to proactively manage their exposure and also seek alternative solutions to using these compounds using PFAS. You will see in the article that Nathan and I wrote that we made reference to some standard kind of exclusion wording. Particularly, I think we referred to the Lloyd's Market Association wording, and you'll see a range of that. And I'd urge you to go back and have a look at the articles that Camilla and Ruth kindly referred to at the beginning of this podcast. I'd also like to also talk about the wider potential exposure in a range of policies. So just pick up on a few other policies which give food for thought when we're talking about the insurance sector in the context of PFAS. Firstly, employers' liability policies, PFAS manufacturers. Obviously, you have employees handling these products. As a result of that, there will be a risk of skin absorption, ingestion, and general handling. So we could see, of course, claims arising from that. And so companies out there should look to their employers' liability policies to see their exposure there. Also, of course, a standard public liability policy. Obviously, that responds to claims arising from an escape or a leak or a degradation of an item that causes some form of personal injury or damage to individuals or to property. So, of course, here you could see a PFAS escape happening and the company looking to a public liability policy to respond. So, again, I think we need to look out for exclusions there if you're a company out there, a risk manager or a director looking at your potential exposure. And then thirdly, of course, most obviously, product liability policies. We've talked about the range of products containing PFAS within the construction sector, but also, of course, food packaging, textiles, clothing, medical devices, and of course, the firefighting foam that Nathan referred to in relation to the Buncefield Institute. Also, of course, cosmetics. So again, I think we need to look at those policies and seeing the exclusion word disappear in those. But obviously, if you operate in those industries, you need to carry out some form of exercise to see whether or not you do have these exclusions. So I think as a general point, as PFAS litigation evolves, we're going to see some exclusions in these different types of policies. Also, I think also extended to professional indemnity policies. I think all four of us do quite a lot of professional indemnity work, but we're certainly going to see those. If they're not already out there now, we're certainly going to see those. And of course, this is going to cause further impact on the construction industry, particularly. So I think that gives you a general idea of the issues arising from PFAS and the insurance industry's response to that. So please, from a risk management perspective, have a look at the policies you've got and see if you are concerned about PFAS, whether or not those exclusion wordings apply.
I think that's really helpful, both. And one thing that comes to mind when both of you have touched off litigation is one can't help but think about the asbestos claims that have been brought in the past. And particularly, Nathan, when you were talking about firefighters and exposure, it really does bring to mind those cases about asbestos exposure. What do you think of this comparison that's being drawn between the two?
Well, you're quite right. The comparison between PFAS and asbestos has received quite a bit of attention in the insurance industry. And this is largely because both substances were, and with PFAS are, still used in a variety of everyday products, as Michael touched on. This results in extensive exposure to a large segment of the population and potentially the resulting health risks. So to give you a few examples, asbestos, for instance, was commonly used in products such as pipe insulation, ceiling tiles, insulated boarding, flooring and roofing shingles. PFAS, by contrast, has been used in a wide range of applications. As we've touched on already, it's in firefighting foam, construction materials, but it's also in water and stain resistant textiles, cosmetics, as Michael mentioned, non-stick cookware, so your non-stick frying pan, as well as food packaging, just for example. And that's just a small range of items that we find PFAS in. So the widespread use of both substances means that a significant portion of the population would have been exposed to them. And that's whether that's through direct contact or through environmental contamination. Billions of pounds have been spent on asbestos compensation claims, including claims against insurers before widely used exclusion clauses came into force, once the full risk of asbestos was better understood. If a similar scenario unfolds with PFAS exposure, then insurers obviously could face another substantial financial burden from claims for compensation or indeed remedial works. So this comparison, we think, underscores the serious risk that PFAS contamination presents to insurers, particularly as the scale of exposure and the potential health risks become more apparent with further scientific research. However, unlike asbestos at the moment, where there is a direct and well-established link to mesothelioma, a cancer affecting the lining of the lungs and other organs, there's currently no specific disease that is conclusively tied to PFAS exposure. As Michael touched on earlier, there are studies that have identified probable links between PFAS exposure and certain illnesses, including kidney cancer, for example, but the research at the moment is not yet conclusive. So as a result, the legal foundations for PFAS-related personal injury claims is currently more speculative than the well-documented asbestos cases that we've seen in the past and continue to see. In addition, given the pervasive use of PFAS in such a wide range of everyday items, not just construction products and materials, unless we can identify a specific PFAS chemical, and that's one of the 14 or 15,000 specific chemicals, and a specific exposure can be identified, proving causation is going to be a lot more difficult than it was with asbestos, for example. Despite this, we've seen PFAS litigation surging in the United States, as we touched on earlier, and over the last decade, there have been a rise in the number of lawsuits filed And again, as Michael touched on, the settlements that we've been reading about and hearing about are reported to be reaching the hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a growing trend that we expect will influence similar legal actions in the UK, where insurers may soon face significant challenges as PFAS-related health, environmental and pollution concerns continue to gain attention, as well as the developing scientific knowledge. As the scale of exposure and the potential links to environmental and health issues becomes clearer, insurers could find themselves confronting a financial burden on par with the long-term costs seen in the asbestos-related litigation.
So as we might see the growing trend in litigation and the sort of science alongside that, would you be able to let our listeners know of any examples of these issues resulting in litigation that you think they should be aware of?
Certainly, I think that Nathan just referred to the litigation we've seen in the United States, and I think that's a starting point before we look at the UK landscape. I think the starting point of litigation is a DuPont litigation in the United States. I just hesitated there because I actually watched the film last night, Dark Waters, which is about the DuPont litigation. If you're in the UK, it's on the BBC iPlayer at the moment, so please watch it. And so this was a claim by residents in West Virginia against DuPont alleging water contaminated by PFOA. And interestingly, a scientific panel that was set out found a probable link. And eventually, and I say eventually, DuPont settled a number of personal injury cases for approximately $670 million. So roughly initially about 200k per injury. In fact, I think those figures might even be conservative when you look at the extent of the litigation and the period of time it took to actually resolve all of the claims. Also in the States, I think mention of the 3M litigation. This claim originally started in 2010. This claim arose around allegation of pollution of natural resources, including, interestingly, pollution of the Mississippi River and of the drinking water, again by PFAS. Again, when you talk about the figures of settlement, obviously to some extent this is a grey area, but I think generally to be accepted that 3M paid about $10.3 billion in settlement to settle this PFAS contamination of water supplies. Alongside that, we've seen litigation in Australia, particularly around the firefighting foam. We've seen that in relation to military air bases. And also we've seen successful litigation claims in Europe, in Belgium and in Sweden. So looking at the UK, I think commonly referred to as what I think we all saw was as the stalking horse litigation. That was in relation to a claim being pursued by residents in Bentham. And that was, again, a PFAS-related action against a firefighting foam manufacturer, which produced these PFAS contamination products. Again, we have this situation where PFAS was reportedly discharged into the water system. And as a result of runoff from testing firefighting foam at a nearby fire factory, this was sent into wastewater lagoons near residential homes. And so, therefore, the Bentham community, as a collective, as a group action, sought to pursue a claim. Now, this matter's been settled. The details of the settlement, we don't know. We do understand, obviously, it's been settled without any admission of liability, but I would obviously speculate there's some financial settlement along with an agreement to carry out remediation in relation to that claim. And obviously, I think that we are going to see more claims like that as we've got growing awareness. Certainly, obviously, there are a lot of environmental groups out there who are seeking to bring pressure on the government. So I'm sure we're going to see lots more litigation arising from PFAS.
Thank you both so much for such a fascinating overview of the topic. And I think this is something that, as you say, our listeners will be seeing more of. Do you have any key takeaways to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I think for me, two points. Firstly, I think it will be important for those in the construction industry to follow developments with the UK's first PFAS plan, which was actually announced earlier this month. And this plan sets out wider measures to monitor PFAS in our rivers, lakes and seas, as well as research into the impact of PFAS contaminated wastewater sludge on soil and potentially stricter PFAS limits in our drinking water. I think specifically this will sort of undoubtedly have an impact on those working in construction for the water sector, but it will have much wider reaching implications as well. The plan also includes the intention to, for the first time, restrict the use of PFAS, starting with firefighting foam, But as we've touched on earlier on, it's undoubtedly going to be the case that restriction or ban is going to be widened in the future. Now, I know Michael has some criticisms of the plan, but I think it is very much a starting point, however late that might be, given our sort of developing knowledge on PFAS. It's quite possible that the regulatory and insurance landscape will change very, very quickly. And I think those in the construction industry need to be ready to act, whether that's by having a better understanding of what products and materials they're using or specifying that might contain PFAS, or to start looking for viable alternatives and understanding their contractual and insurance exposure. Then I think I'll hand over to Michael to sort of raise some of the points I think he's got in criticism of the plan. But I've then got sort of another example of sort of litigation potentially to watch out for that I'll touch on after Michael's comments.
Thanks, Nathan. Yes, just in relation to the plan, I think there is some criticism in relation to the plan. I think primarily is the fact that it focuses on research and monitoring rather than introducing regulatory action. I think if you go back to the early litigation, one of the criticisms was where you have an industry that's self-regulation, then these issues often take much longer to eradicate and to be resolved. And I think that's one of the things in the plan. There isn't actually any regulatory action that's immediately proposed in relation to it. Also, I think if you look at the timelines, are not immediate, unlike the EU. So we're moving towards restrictions, but we're not there yet, and there's no timelines set out in the ban. And I think also, particularly, there's no legally enforceable controls within this plan on drinking water. So I would suggest that perhaps that leaves a question in relation to accountability. So unfortunately, I think that's one of the things that should have been addressed in the plan. And of course, there's no requirement yet to fund cleanup. And when you look at the context of this podcast as a whole, there's no requirement, which is fine. And I know we are in an environment industry in the UK where the majority of players within the industry do want to do the right thing and are particularly environmentally conscious. But it's interesting that we do have other environmental legislation that does require cleanup, but we aren't seeing that yet. So those are my kind of initial criticism in relation to the plan at present, and I'll hand back to you, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I think sort of just touching on some of those points as well. There's sort of in the last 12, 18 months, there's also an investigation going on in Lancashire in the Hill House Technology Enterprise Zone. And that's in relation to contamination from a former ICI chemicals and paint plant. So it will be interesting to see how that investigation pans out. And that may well inform tighter regulation and also the types of remedial schemes and works that might be necessary to deal with these contaminated sites.
And can I just add one final thing on the back of that? It's one thing we haven't talked about is there's an interesting case in Italy, which I won't go through the details of that case, but I think the interesting thing there was that there was a criminal conviction which resulted in prison sentences. So I think, leaving on a risk management point, I think for the directors and officers out there, you have to look at this issue. And unfortunately, in that situation, I think the executives got prison sentences totaling 141 years.
Well, thanks, Michael. I think that's an important point to leave our listeners on, which is the risk factor in all of this. As you said earlier, there's a growing but a crucially robust evidence base around this. And so I certainly think some forward thinking is required. And whether that's in environmental product declarations, which we touched off earlier, and of course we've had Dr. Jane Anderson on the podcast before talking about that, or it's whether construction contracts need to be accompanied by strict compliance or reporting. And I think those points are really practical for our listeners to think about and reflect on. But finally, I think we need to give a particular thanks to Michael for reminding us of that great film, Dark Waters. And I think that couldn't be interpreted by anything else other than a bid for Michael to join the Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo film podcast. So I'll put something into their producers, Michael, don't worry. But thank you both so much for joining the podcast. It's a huge topic, and I think it's one that often comes up without the depth that's required to really discuss it in detail. So we really appreciate both your expertise, and in the show notes we'll be linking both of your brilliant articles as well, so people can read more on that. So thanks for joining the podcast, and thanks to our listeners for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. At 39 Essex Chambers, we cover a vast array of practice areas and sectors. You can find out more about our expertise and our barristers at 39essex.com, where you can also see our extensive catalogue of articles, podcasts and webinars.